Making the classic roll collar coat. Part 11. Trim seams and turn collar through. We need to trim and clip the seam allowance all the way around the outer edge so that we have a nice crisp finish when we turn through. We want to do a graduated trim for best results. The seam allowance of the facing that forms the outer collar we want to trim back less. The seam allowance of the lower facing, that's the part without interfacing, we want to trim back more. This reduces the risk of a ridge around the collar and down the front of the coat when this edge is pressed. This is a graduated trim. I'm trimming back to 1/4 of an inch or so. Here again, I'm reducing the bulk at this crossing seam. So continue trimming up to the point where the collar rolls. Then I'm turning the coat over and trimming the seam allowance of the under collar back to 1/4 of an inch. Most importantly, miter the collar points. One cut across the point, as close as is comfortable. Then cut again across the angles on either side. Then we need to take some clips out of this curve. And also snip this curved edge to get a nice flat edge when turned through. So snip up to the collar point where the seam allowance needs to stretch when turned through. Take notches out here where the seam allowance needs to contract when turned through. Remember the rules. Grade your seam allowance, clip inner curves and notch outer curves. I'm going to take off a little more from the collar curve. That will turn nicely. I quite like to use a wooden knitting needle for this job. It's not too sharp at the point. Then using it to push out the seam. This is best done as you press. So we will be pushing out the seam all the way along and pressing as we go. So before turning, press the front edge up to the seam allowance. Then fold and roll the seam line very slightly to the inside. That looks good, a nice crisp edge, and the seam is hidden. When you get to the collar itself, you want to encourage the seam to the underside of the collar. With practice, you can do this very quickly. It pays to get it right at this stage. I'm showing this process with no editing cuts, so that you can see that it is just a question of doing it a bit at a time. Just press bit by bit until you are happy with the curve of the collar. All the time keeping an eye on that seam line so that it remains to the underside. That's looking good. Now continue down the front edge. A great result. A quick look at the results of our efforts on the stand. Next, we will sew the two seam allowances together at the back neckline. The seams are pressed open. We want to match the corners and pin the seam allowances together. Then using matching thread, backstitch the seam allowances together. It doesn't have to be neat. Use smallish stitches to keep these seams from separating. You could do this at the sewing machine, but you have more control if you stitch by hand. secure at the shoulder point. This will keep the collar in good shape. The next step is to apply some bonding to stop these layers from separating. We could top stitch, which is what I like to do more often than not, but this time I rather fancy the crisp plain edge of the linen. Before we had modern bonding materials, we would catch stitch our interfacing in place initially. We would then catch stitch the facing to the interfacing, doing our best not to have stitches showing on the right side. But the modern way is to use something like this, which fuses fabrics together. So we need only fuse our layers from about here to the hemline, or just above. Folding back the facing, place the bonding web about here. We want to leave enough of the facing free so that we can attach the lining. We need a bit of damp for this job, so set your iron to steam and iron until bonded. If you are using a different product, check the manufacturer's instructions. It's pretty well bonded, but it's best left to dry. I'm going to hand baste along the front edges to keep them in place until the garment is finished. Do the other side the same. The next job is to attach our pocket bag. Sewing tutorials supported by AngelaKane.com membership, sewing pattern sales and fan funding. For news of up-and-coming videos, please subscribe to our channel. Once subscribed, set your preferences to be notified by email. Thank you very much for watching.